صباح الخير. مشكورين على الدعوة الكريمة. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sophie Smith and I'm the founder and CEO of NabtaHealth, a hybrid healthcare provider for women in the Middle East. Today, I am going to tell you a story about an industry that was crafted by and for people who, until recently, were severely ill on occasion, but were mostly and fundamentally well. Since then, in the last 50 years, those same people have become, due to lifestyle changes, sedentary lifestyles predominantly, accidentally unwell, leaving this industry drowning in costs, in wait times, in patients who present with one invisible illness and half a dozen invisible illnesses, patients who, despite repeated interventions and a lifetime of medication, never get better. But let me take a step back. As with most industries, the healthcare industry was founded by a combination of great thinkers, people who mostly existed in places of learning, and great doers, people who more often than not honed their trade during times of war. Among the great thinkers were the likes of Hippocrates, one of the fathers of modern medicine, credited with inventing the Hippocratic Oath and defining the very first clinical pathways, or Ibn Sina, whose primary work, the Canon, was the primary textbook in modern medicine in the Arab world and Europe during the 17th century. Among the great doers, we have the likes of Florence Nightingale, who published some of the first quality measure improvements for medical care, such as the reduction of overcrowding, provision of ventilation, and clearing of sewers, measures that she had introduced during the Crimean War in 1854. Or Marie Curie, who used her pioneering work in radioactivity, which won her 2 Nobel Prizes, to develop small mobile X-ray units that could be used to diagnose injuries near the battlefront in World War I. All of these pioneers had one thing in common. They developed tools, medicines, and interventions to deal with the diagnosis, treatment, and rehabilitation of single diseases which, after the application of a standardized methodology, went away and could be forgotten about. You see now, I think, where I'm getting to with this story, that the history of modern medicine and of our established healthcare ecosystems is one of acute diseases, temporary illnesses and ailments with centuries of established learning behind them, which, with the application of a standardized treatment methodology, do go away and the patients get better. But the world we live in today is not a world of acute diseases. In 2022, the vast majority of our disease burden is chronic. Chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes are responsible for 70% of deaths worldwide, or about 41 million dead people for every journey around the sun. The problem with chronic disease is that they are slow, outwardly invisible, and have absolutely nothing to do with medications we take or interventions we choose. They have everything to do with how we live, with how much we move, with what we eat, and with whether we sleep or not. Boring, maybe. Critical to our survival as a species, also yes. Let me share some stark facts with you. In the US, which still considers itself a world leader in most things, 88% of adults are insulin resistant. That's 2/3 of all normal weight adults, and there aren't many of those around anymore. 92% of overweight adults and over 99.5% of obese adults. To briefly explain insulin resistance, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, when you consume sugar, your body produces insulin, which helps remove that sugar from your blood and into your cells where it can be used for energy. And this system works perfectly until you flood your body with a lot of sugar, at which point your pancreas produces more insulin, which then hits your cells really hard in an effort to get rid of the excess sugar. If it does that often enough, then like anything else, your cells get fed up of being hit and they become insulin resistant, which means that you then have excess insulin floating around in your bloodstream. If that keeps happening, then the insulin becomes super ineffective at removing sugar from your bloodstream, and you end up with high blood sugar as well, a condition we've all heard of, type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance is important because people with insulin resistance are at high risk of developing every single other chronic disease that I mentioned before. And there's more. Let's dial back a moment to March 2020 and the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. It didn't take long for healthcare experts to realize that if you had an underlying health condition, you were at risk for COVID-19. The same, by the way, is true for any communicable disease that you have. If your body, if your immune system has to muster some sort of response to anything from seasonal food to HIV, an underlying health condition makes it that much harder. What US-based healthcare experts didn't realize at the time, and still don't, is that the pool of at-risk people was almost 90% of adult Americans. We don't have comparable statistics for other countries, but you can be sure that where similar lifestyles occur, office-based working, home delivery, fast food consumption, excess screen time, including most of the GCC, the prevalence of insulin resistance will also be similar. But why should we really care about chronic disease? Why, with everything else that we have to care about, do chronic diseases matter? Well, for two reasons. One, chronic diseases are making us infertile. Between 1973 and 2011, the sperm count in the West dropped by 59% and is tending to zero by 2045. What that means is that in 23 years' time, almost 100% of couples in the West will struggle to start families. That's our children. But before you get too smug, this is happening even faster here. A recent study by Frost and Sullivan indicated that by 2032, 97% of couples will struggle to fall pregnant. That's not our children, that's us. Two, despite all of the learnings from COVID-19, the emergency response systems, the track and trace, the vaccination drives, the prevalence of chronic disease leaves us wide open to another global pandemic of even more devastating economic proportions, because our at-risk population is not the 10% over 65, it's the 90% who live, often unknowingly, with at least one chronic disease. And this brings me, at last, to why the future of healthcare is hybrid, combining digital and traditional healthcare along decentralized, patient-centric clinical pathways to enable people to manage their health wherever and whoever they are. Because the burden of healthcare provision no longer resides with established healthcare providers, how could it? The majority of the disease burden is no longer acute, but rather chronic. Nor does it entirely lie with governments, regardless of whether healthcare is a public service or not. While governments are critical for incentivizing their populations to live well, they are only representatives of their population and cannot live for them. Similarly, it is not entirely the responsibility of other industries that could be blamed for the steady decline in human health, such as the farming industry with its abuse of hormones and its rapid depletion of soils, nor the sugar industry, which, as well as resulting in substantial CO2 emissions and land use, is also possibly the greatest single contributor to human ill health in recent times. The truth is, the burden of healthcare provision doesn't really lie with any one industry, corporate, or government body. Instead, the burden of healthcare management resides in the corporeal body, in the individuals responsible for the decisions that allow them to be either accidentally well or very unwell. That's you and me. The future of healthcare is hybrid, because today we have the tools here to enable us to reverse the rapid ascent of chronic disease. Before we see a doctor, before we book ourselves in for a gastric bypass, before we end up in the back of an ambulance or worse, a morgue, we have our phones, computers more powerful than the ones that landed Apollo 11 on the moon. We have wearable devices and point-of-care tests and artificial intelligence that can calculate 15 vital signs using only the blood flow in our faces. Healthcare will always be a highly profitable business for those that engage in it well, but we must not forget, least of all at FII, where the focus is on positively impacting humanity, that the ultimate beneficiaries of an adaptive, inclusive, and truly hybrid healthcare ecosystem must always be people like you and me. Thank you.